So today I would like to take just a few minutes to talk through snow with you. At this point, you should have already completed your close reading and your discussion board. So I just want to go through some of the high points of the story in just a few moments. First and foremost, here are your discussion questions. We are going to walk through each of these, talk through it just a little bit. But before we do that, I want to talk through the story. I have opened up the link that I sent you to see the story. There's a couple of things that I want you to know about the story first and foremost. This story starts with, I remember the cold night you brought in a pile of logs and a chipmunk jumped off as you lowered your arms. This sentence is really important, even though it doesn't seem like a lot. It's telling us a lot. It's telling us that we have someone who's talking to someone else in his or her own way. And it says, I remember, which tells us that this story is being told in the first person retrospect. This is an important detail for us because that tells us that the events of the story happened a while ago in the past, and that our narrator is looking back on those moments. Again, this is an important detail because it means that this event, this time in this narrator's life was so important that the narrator feels it necessary to come back and tell us about this. So we understand that our narrator's trying to muddle through some things. The next thing I want to bring to your attention in this paragraph is that we have a variety of memories in this first paragraph. The first one relates to the chipmunk, and we see our narrator kind of looking back at this fondly. This chipmunk came in, and it was stopping at the library and at the front door, and it knew the house well, and it was kind of this exciting moment, right? Um, but then we have our writer comment on this, or our narrator comment. Well, this would be difficult to believe. Yes, I know it's very strange that this chipmunk would come in, except for perhaps the subject of a poem. I noticed in several of your responses with your close reading that you mentioned, what does she mean? This would be difficult for anyone to believe, except perhaps as the subject of a poem. This is a part of that metafiction, which we'll talk about in a moment, where our writer's almost stepping in and saying, yep, this sounds about right. Like, this seems made up, even though we're being told it's the truth. Then we get another memory. Our next memory comes in the wallpaper, and we see her talking about how they're remodeling this house, that they're out in the country, and that there are these grapes that come in, or there's this grape wallpaper, and they're painting over it. And she says, I thought of the bits of grape that remained underneath and imagined the vine popping through, the way some plants can tenaciously push through anything. This is considered to be a metaphor of this relationship with this couple, where maybe the problems are going to continue pushing through. The next thing we see is the day of the big snow, where she ties the towel around his head like a crazy king of the snow. Some of you question, oh, well, does she know how to tie a turban? Is she being legitimate here? We don't really know. But what is interesting about this is that it kind of shows us how she thinks of him as this king of the snow. She's really very much idealizing, not idolizing, but ideal, idealizing him. Then she goes on to tell us that people liked the idea of our being together, leaving the city for the country. So many people visited, and the fireplace made all of them want to tell amazing stories. The child who happened to be standing on the right corner when the door of the ice cream truck came open and hundreds of popsicles crashed out. The man standing on the beach, sand sparkling in the sun, one bit glinting more than the rest, stooping to find a diamond ring. Did they talk about amazing things because they thought we'd turn into one of them? It seems like maybe in the moment that's what she believed, but then she says, now I think they probably guessed it wouldn't work. It was as hopeless as giving a child a matched cup and saucer. This is a really important line, and many of you said in your annotations, wait, I don't understand what that means. If you were having tea, you would give your guest your nice china. So a matched cup and saucer that goes together. But if you give that to a child, that's problematic. A, because it's your good china and a child might drop it. And B, because they couldn't care less if their saucer, the little plate that goes under your teacup, matched your teacup or not. So she's basically saying, yep, our relationship was about as hopeless as that because a child wouldn't care and it would ultimately break. So our relationship really was probably pretty hopeless. And then we get into this final memory. Remember the night out on the lawn, knee deep in snow. She mentions the Queen Anne's lace. Everything's white. She says later headlights off. Our car was the first to ride through the newly fallen snow. The world outside the car looked solarized. It was bright, solar, sun. It was bright, and she was looking at, everything looked wonderful. Remember, bright, hope. And yet, just a couple of lines before, she was telling us, oh, yeah, in hindsight, this was probably hopeless. Then we have a turn in this story where it says, you remember it differently. And we find out that our narrator, who we can assume is probably a female, our narrator sees this relationship differently than her former lover did. It says, you remember it differently. You remember the cold settled in stages. The small curve of light was shaved from moon night after night until they were no longer surprised by the sky was black. The chipmunk was just running to hide in the dark, not to escape. That the visitors told the same old stories. And then as she says this, and this is a really important line, it says, one night giving me a lesson in storytelling, you said any life will seem dramatic if you omit mention of most of it. Again, we see her looking to him for guidance as maybe he's taking on a role of more of an authority or a teacher. She's again idealizing him and maybe idolizing him a bit. But what we see her do here is any life will seem dramatic if you omit mention of most of it. And then in the next line, she says, this then for the drama. I mentioned metafiction in your questions, and again, we'll come back to that again. But here we see our writer coming in and saying, yep, now wait for this. I'm going to tell you something that's dramatic. It says, I drove back to the house not that long ago. It was April and Alan had died. Many of you said, well, who's Alan? Is Alan the lover? No. Alan was the next door neighbor who was a friend to them. And she says that he was a friend even in the bad times. So this was someone who was important to her. And she's back and she's looking over the backyard and there was Alan's pool. And it says it was still covered with black plastic that had been stretched across it for the winter. It had rained, and as the rain had fell, the cover collected more and more water until it finally spilled over on the concrete. This is an important image, and we'll come back to it in a bit. She says that when she left that day, she went by their old home, and it said that there were 3 or 4 crocuses, which are flowers, were blooming in the front yard with just a few dots of white, no field of snow. I felt embarrassed for them. They couldn't compete. This line is a little bit ambiguous for a couple of reasons. We don't know if she's saying she felt embarrassed because there were only 2 or 3 flowers and a little bit of snow. But most people believe that it was not that she was actually saying, that she's saying she felt embarrassed for the people who lived with them because they didn't have the snow that she and her former lover had. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. Then she tells us, she goes back to talking about the story. Again, that metafiction. This is a story told the way you said stories should be told. Somebody grew up, fell in love, and spent a winter with her lover in the country. It's really a very basic form of the story. She goes on to say, this is, of course, it's the barest outline and futile to discuss. It's as pointless as throwing birdseed on the ground while snow still falls fast. Who expects small things to survive when even the largest get lost? Here we have our narrator kind of talking about this idea of love and this relationship, and she's pointing out, yep, even something as large as love, what they had, the snow, as much as the snow can't survive. So why would we expect birdseed to? Again, we get this idea of hopelessness, pointlessness. And then it says, people forget years and remember moments. Seconds and symbols are left to sum things up. The black shroud over the pool. We see her coming back to this black shroud. If we go back and think about that pool covering, the water was spilling over it, couldn't hold it all. Again, probably emblematic of their love. Then she talks specifically about love. Love in its shortest form becomes a word. What I remember about all that time is one winter, the snow. Even now, saying snow, my lips move so that they kiss the air. If you do this with your lips, they legitimately will feel like they're kissing the air. And we understand now that the story is not simply just about snow, snow as, that wet, cold stuff that falls on the ground, but that for this story, snow is equivalent to love. Snow symbolizes love, and all of these other things build toward that. Then in this final line, this seems a bit, students often have trouble with this. It says, no mention has been made of the snowplow that seemed always to be there, scraping snow off our narrow road, an artery cleared, though neither of us could have said where the heart was. This is kind of a confusing image. I mean, we understand what it is, but we don't really know what she's trying to say here. But I think the hint is in this last little bit. She says that their road was an artery cleared, though neither of us could have said where the heart was. Just like their love, the snow, the things that were causing problems with their snow were often cleared, but they didn't really know where the heart of the relationship was, maybe explaining why the relationship ultimately did not make it. Let's go over to the questions. This is number 1 says, discuss the use of snow as a symbol throughout the story. How does the narrator feel about her past relationship, and how is it revealed through the snow? I think when we look back at all of those different examples that I just pointed out, we understand that even though this relationship didn't work out well and there were clearly differing perspectives, that this narrator looks back fondly on this time. She says, even now, when I say the word snow, my lips kiss the air. That's not someone who's bitter about a relationship or angry. She looks back at this as still a good time in her life. The second question says, snow is an example of flash fiction, which is a short story. So it's a short story that's 3-4 pages at most. In flash fiction, often the details readers are left to determine on their own are as important, if not more important, than the details given to the reader by the writer. What are some of the details you would like to know? Several of you had questions. What are their names? How old are they? How long were they in the country? It feels like it was just one winter, although if we're paying close attention, we understand that it may have been many winters that they were in this particular area in the snow. We don't know the characters' names. We don't know their ages. We don't know exactly where they are. We just know they're in the country. And that can be very frustrating for a reader. But what we can assume is that the female is telling the story and that our male is the you in the story. Additionally, something that's important to note is I know that some of you looked up in your previewing a little bit about Ann Beatty, and you might have come to the conclusion that Ann Beatty was writing this about her relationship at that time, or a relationship she was kind of going through a divorce in at the time she wrote this. That may very well be true. However, we have to remember that our narrator is unnamed, so we have to assume that it's not the author. When it's an unnamed narrator, it's not Anne is doing this or Ann Beatty is doing this. It's the unnamed narrator. So when you're writing about the story, make sure you clarify that. You don't want to be calling the narrator Ann Beatty. The next thing is question 3. The story is told in third person retrospective. It's actually first person retrospective. That was my fault, which means that the narrator is telling the story after it has occurred. Why is the point of view necessary to develop the theme? This is really important because we want to understand exactly where this story is coming from. With this, it's coming from the woman, and understanding that it's her perspective and how she's looking back on it makes this a stronger story for us. And then finally, we have the metafiction, and it's defined as an author's allusion to the artificiality of a work. In other words, the writer comments on the creation of the work and how they are writing the work through the narrator of the story. How does Beatty use metafiction? Provide an example. Why does she do this? How does it help or hurt the overall effectiveness of her story? This is really much up to your own interpretation and an opinion, but I did point out a couple of places. When she says over here, now this for the drama, or this story is the way you said they should be told, things like that. She's pointing out, we have Ann Beatty coming in saying, okay, yep, this is how I'm telling the story. And it is meant to remind us this is fiction and I'm making this up. But it doesn't take away from the fact that this is a universal idea, that love is a lot like snow. It's beautiful at first, and then it kind of gets dirty with time, with mud, with melting, and then it goes away. But it doesn't mean that you don't look back on it fondly. If you have any questions, please feel free to, reach out to me at any time.